Hello, Garland Nixon here, and there's been a apparently congressional report that supports the concept of a lab leak for COVID. However, it points to Wuhan, and I have a different perspective on that. And Joe Biden's talking about doing some pardons, and Dr. Fauci's name's floating around. A lot of weird stuff going on. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here with Dr. Jim Kavanagh. Jim, welcome back to the Critical Hour. You were very well received on my humble channel by the people in the chat and the people watching our last show. Thanks a lot for coming back, Jim.
Thank you for having me, Garland. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
All right, couple of things here we're going to talk about. Let's get started here, and then we'll blend in several different things. There has been a congressional report, and of course, what do you know, like every other congressional report that comes out, bad things were done in China. It's always in China. Have you ever noticed that? Anything that happens, a congressional report finds that there was evil deeds done in China. Wuhan, why, that's where the virus came from. Let me show you something. We're going to go through a couple of different things, and I'm going to real quick show you and my audience, just put two things together. Look at this. This is August 2nd, okay? This is 2019.
Mm-hmm.
People will recall the end of 2019 is when we were told that that patient zero, according to the Department of Defense, patient zero was November 6th or 7th of 2019. That's a part of the DOD. Here's August 2nd, months before. Fort Detrick lab shut down after failed safety inspection. All research halted indefinitely. So Fort Detrick is near me, unfortunately, in Maryland, up in Frederick, Maryland. And they do all kinds of stuff with all kinds of nasty viruses and all kinds of things. So they get shut down. All research was shut down there at a laboratory that handles high-level disease-causing material. In June, remember? So in June, inspectors found several areas of concern in standard operating procedures. They go on to say the suspension was due to multiple causes, including failure to follow local procedures, lack of recertification, blah, blah, blah. When you look into it, one of the issues, when you start looking into several things, one of the issues that was brought up repeatedly is biocontainment. So we see that in June, there was a weird Fort Detrick lab shut down in Maryland. Now, let me show you one other article that I think we need to look at that goes along with that. This is NBC Washington. Let me get it. Okay. Crap. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay, look at this. July 17th. Cause of respiratory illness is still unknown after dozens sickened at Virginia retirement community. Fairfax County, not all that far away. Health officials said they have yet a cause of respiratory illness that sickened more than 60 residents at a Northern Virginia senior living community, right? It goes on to say Green Spring retirement community. 3 people have died. Those who died were older and had complex health problems. Outbreak was reported in the assisted living and skilled, 63 residents. Let's do one more. Let's do one more, Jim, just to make my point. if there's a point to be made. 2 dead from unknown respiratory virus. What could it be? July 11th. So in June, Fort Detrick they find that there's something weird going on at Fort Detrick, and it shuts down. And unknown respiratory virus, Jim, what could it be? And they go on to talk about that. And they say they thought it was Legionnaire's disease, but that's a bacteria. And they say, but if news is are accurate, the causative agent is viral, right? And it says the virus is unlikely to be influenza because it says while a person can get the flu at any time of the year, flu season runs from late fall through winter to early spring. It's probably not that. In the middle of the summer, people are getting some virus. They don't know what it is. And it's not far from Fort Detrick. Now, what we also, when you look into that, it happened at a couple of different places. That could cause one to be suspicious. What do you think?
If you had a nasty mind, suspicious mind, we're going to our Elvis Presley songs. Yeah, and you also notice, we talked about this a lot, and I credit you for bringing this up and remembering this. And you have some articles about it, that there was this mysterious vaping disease or vaping, again, some kind of respiratory illness. And they said this is from vaping, and we got to stop. And it was like 2 months of
August 16th.
Fear mongering about vaping and how we've got to get people have to care about vaping because there's some strange disease that's causing people's lungs. And that was, again, that's disappeared, that whole vaping disease thing, right? That was around for a while after COVID came out. Oh, never hear about that again.
Look at this. A large number, this is the mysterious vaping disease.
Yeah.
A large number of those stricken ill have been hospitalized, with some in intensive care and on ventilators.
And that was also in Maryland and Virginia, I think.
In the area.
Yeah. So that, it's very suspicious. And, there's a guy, I think his name is Andrew Huff, who wrote about this, and he's written, that this all came out of North Carolina and Ralph Baric, and it all came out of, that's why it was in Wuhan. Fauci and Baric outsourced gain of function research when during the Obama administration they put a hold on gain of function research, and Fauci argued against that. Fauci argued to continue gain of function research, and he did continue it by putting it in biolabs all around the world. In Ukraine, in the country of Georgia, which is an interesting thing to think about now. I forget the woman's name who did a great series of articles about
I've never heard her before. Yes.
Yeah, Georgian reporter who did a series of articles about the bioweapons labs and American bioweapons labs in Georgia and in China. And it is strange what they did with Wuhan. I think Huff's point is that they kind of sucked the Chinese into playing along with them. But it's if you want to say dual use scientific research, we're going to find out how nasty pathogens work. We're not actually creating them for the purpose for bioweapons research. It's for bioweapons defense research. So they're using the ambiguity of what's a defensive weapon and an offensive weapon. We're going to create these new highly infectious and highly dangerous to human viruses out of other viruses, and we're going to create it. And but we're not doing that as a bioweapon, even though the Department of Defense and, were all involved in this. And this is how Fauci became the highest paid government employee, because during the Bush administration, Cheney reorganized the bioweapons research and put it under Fauci's NIAID, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious. So Fauci, he made Fauci the overall czar of all kinds of biological, including bioweapons research. And that's why Fauci because he had so many responsibilities, he became the highest paid government employee. So this was all something that was kind of deliberately put together so you couldn't sort out biological research on potentially dangerous pathogens, and we have to get vaccines for it, from biological research to create dangerous pathogens, for military purposes. And that's now all of those biolabs in Ukraine that, first of all, they said weren't there. And then Victoria Nuland got up and said, oh, yeah, they are there. We don't want the Russians to get a hold of them. And the Russians have all kinds of information about that. And, that's why the vaccines were put under the this was all under the Department of Defense and CDC. But the Department of Defense had ultimate control of these things. Even the vaccines were a countermeasure under the Department of Defense. So this is all very plausible. And, I also recommend everybody look. Sam Husseini has done great work on Ebola, where Ebola came from in Africa. And, and also, suspicions about AIDS, where it came from in Africa. And so a lot of this, is extremely plausible, and it's hard to find the answers to it. But the evidence is there. This is one of the things that's so annoying when you say when you bring up certain things and people say, well, there's no evidence for that. The vaccines this vaccine may be harmful. Oh, there's no evidence for that. It's not that there's no, what they mean is there's no dispositive evidence. There's no proof of it. There's plenty of evidence. It may be, what do you call incidental evidence?
Right. Circumstantial evidence.
Circumstantial evidence, yeah. Or what? But that's not evidence. The way you prove things is you look into evidence that comes up and see where it goes. If you say there's no evidence for that, meaning when you really mean there's no proof of it, you're never going to look at the evidence. You'll never find the proof. But if they're arguing forward, this vaccine is perfectly safe and effective, they'll take one incidental fact and say, oh, look, that's the proof. For their side, any bit of evidence becomes proof. For the side that they oppose, there's no evidence at all unless you have proof. And that's the kind of the rhetorical and logical game you end up playing with them, and it stinks. So, certainly, look, people like Michael Yeadon, scientist who worked for Pfizer for like 20, 30 years, of vice president of research at Pfizer. And he has been very clear about certain products that were given to the people. He could not believe it. This cannot be accidental. They made these products with the most deadly and most dangerous elements of the virus they were looking at. This was done in a way that it's hard to see how it could not be deliberately dangerous. And this guy, Angus Dalgleish in England, who says, look, there are at least 6 different insertions made into the virus here, this about the COVID virus itself, that could not be accidental or evolutionary. These are deliberate insertions in the virus. So it's clear that something was going on in the Wuhan lab that was an American Chinese thing, but it was really pushed by the Americans and by the desire of people like Barack to do their gain of function research and people like Fauci to support him. And they found willing partners in China, and that became a mess. And everybody's trying to cover up for it. And that's all of these things are indications of that.
As an old investigator, when you talk about evidence, right? What they're saying is this: we don't yet have a preponderance of the evidence, but preponderance of the evidence being 51-49. You know what I mean? 51%. Yeah. That is like in a criminal case, you need beyond reasonable doubt to a moral certainty. In a civil case, you only need a preponderance of the evidence. It's more likely than not that whatever is alleged to have happened, right? So when you say, okay, here is a particular piece of evidence. It's not conclusive, but here's a particular piece of evidence that should be taken into account. And the opposition will say, basically, well, you don't have a preponderance of the evidence. Well, no, I don't have a preponderance of the evidence until I do. Right? So I started an investigation, and I find out that the murder was committed on June 12th at the corner of 12th and Elm. And I find out that at that time, Jim Kavanagh was driving or walking in that area. That doesn't mean that he's a murderer.
With my silenced pistol.
But that's evidence. And I say, do you have anything? Well, I got a lead. You know, the head of investigations, which I was, says, you got anything? I got a lead. What do you got? Well, the one guy we were looking at, we found out that he's in the area. I got to go track that down. I go investigate it. I look into all kinds of things and I come back. What'd you find? I found that he was in the area. It appears that he's not the killer. I talked to him, but he said he saw a man running with a black jacket. Right? So now the fact that Jim Kavanagh was in the area of the murder is a piece of evidence, but it's not a preponderance of the evidence that he's the killer. And it may lead me to more evidence. So it seems to me that it is dishonest, at least when you say, well, we've got a piece of evidence and we need to look at that. We need to take this into account. And it's summarily dismissed as though if you can't provide me with one piece of evidence that's conclusive, then I have to ignore all other evidence. And to me, it seems so defensive that you have to be suspicious that people take those kind of positions, know that their arguments are weak. And they're digging in to automatically defend them.
And with drugs especially, you know, you got to be careful when you introduce new drugs into the population. And when you introduce new drugs in the population and you see, oh, X number of people after taking this drug within 2 weeks or 2 months, you know, had a heart attack or got cancer or you know, got eczema or whatever, you know, that's a reason to investigate. Those are pieces of evidence that are reasons to investigate. But with certain drugs, if you say, oh, wait a minute, look at what happened after people took these drugs. They did this happened to them, got myocarditis. They got this, they got that. Kids who never get wet. Oh, you don't have any evidence. That's a reason not to investigate. If you don't have the proof, any evidence becomes irrelevant and you're pointing to the evidence is a sign of how stupid you are for thinking that means anything. And you know, and instead of it becoming a reason to investigate and a motivation for investigation, it becomes a reason to stop thinking about it, to stop investigating, etc. And that's what happens. And that's one of the differences between this class of drugs, this concept we have of drugs called vaccines as harmless magic bullets. And if you challenge that, then you can't do that. Okay. Whereas other drugs, all right, maybe it's good drug for preventing. It really works to prevent nausea in pregnant women. Great drug for that. Thalidomide. You know, I mean, we have other evidence that comes up that maybe there's something else going on. Oh, you don't say, oh, we can't look into thalidomide. We can't look at this other evidence. This evidence doesn't mean anything. It's not evidence because it's not proof. You look into it. Vioxx. Oh, this is a great drug for headaches. It also kills you by a heart attack. You start looking at the indication of that, you got to look into it. Okay. But with vaccines, oh, there's indications of no. You're an anti-vaxxer. You're a moron. You're anti-scientific. Blah, blah, blah. And that doesn't mean anything because it's not, you don't have any evidence. You just have,
how about this? Trust the science. And my position was always science is a method. And so, yes, I trust the method. And oh, by the way, this is part of the method of science. The method of science is simple. Somebody comes up with a theory and you evaluate things that will support the theory. You bring in people that will poke holes in the theory. You bring in people that say, I absolutely disagree with that. This is part of science, and I'm going to try to prove it wrong. That person is valuable to the scientific process. Mm-hmm. The old 10th man, as they say, theory, where if 9 people believe in something, the 10th man, all his job is to come in and say, I disagree with it and try to disprove it. Right. Yeah. I don't know if you ever heard of the 10th man theory. Right. Yeah. And it's like that's kind of a scientific method to say, even if we all agree that if you jump off a building, you'll never go up. We got one guy that says it's wrong. He's a critical part of this. His job is to come in and try to prove that sometimes you'll go up. And if it's wrong, then we can all walk away and say, we did our job. We bought somebody in. Literally, you had people on Facebook, Twitter, on social media. And the person would say, I took this particular medicine. Well, we all know it's very safe and effective. In fact, Jim and I will probably get a couple of extra boosters as soon as we get off, right? But my point is, you had people who said, I took this medication. And I had the following problem. I couldn't move my neck. Sometimes it was, wasn't real serious. They didn't drop dead, but it was something. I took this medication and I had this problem. And they would block them and throw them off.
Yeah.
The person who experienced it themselves. And the person would say, and I went to a doctor and the doctor said this, and they're trying to treat me with horse paste because people that had some issues from the particular medicine were actually treated with the horse paste, right?
Yeah.
So they're like, okay, this is my experience and I have the documentation to show what happened. You can't get any more scientific than that. And they would suspend the person's account and throw them off and say you didn't go along with community guidelines, even though it happened to you and you have the documentation. I think that's what we call a tell that they know something is dirty, Jim.
Yeah, well, it's very nasty. And we went through 2 years of this, and the people who did it are not taking responsibility for it. They're not being held to account for this. They just want to forget about it or pretend they didn't do what they did. And it's very, very bad. It's one of the things that, they don't want to talk about, but got people so pissed off at the Democrats and the Biden administration, because their attitude was shut up. We don't want to hear if we have a position on something, and something which is, again, this is not particularly political. I mean, people talked about, the discussion of whether a drug is dangerous or not, or any pharmaceutical intervention or a surgical intervention. This is not. It really has nothing to do with politics, unless you want to make it having something to do with politics. And they did, and then they politicized it and said, if you have a certain position on this that's skeptical in any way or critical in any way, then you are a person of this nasty political stripe.
You're a Trumper.
Which
they
is
literally
crazy.
say that. You're
crazy.
You're a Trumper.
And a Trumper, yeah, you're a Trumper. I mean, what people, doctors around the world who have nothing to do with Donald Trump or any Donald Trump movement, we're saying, oh, let's look at this and let's look at that. And American media and liberal politicians, oh, they are Trumpers. What are you talking about? They have nothing to do with Trump. This guy, Dr. Rouault in France, who was, I think, one of the first people who talked about hydroxychloroquine. Anyway, this is what we had. And it was extremely nasty. It was not trivially nasty. It possibly, and I think definitely did lead to very bad physical outcomes. People, it's hurt people, it's killed people, it's still killing people, and we can't still talk about it. And so that's one of the most dangerous things. Is you can't dismiss how dangerous this is. This is millions of people whose lives have been affected, whose physical health and life has been affected drastically by this, and it's still going on, and you still can't talk about it reasonably. So it's one of the I've never been through something like that over such a period of time, where so many people took such strong positions that were so obviously right now wrong, and they can't admit it. They can't admit they were wrong. And they're going to go after. They're going after Bhattacharya for herd immunity, as if he invented that term. It was some kind of strange thing that he came up with, and it means something like everybody's got to be allowed to die. This is a term that's been in the context of health for decades, if not centuries, and he was just describing he and the thousands of doctors who agreed with him were just describing ways of achieving herd immunity, and suddenly this term herd immunity became some kind of nasty thing that Jay Bhattacharya invented to kill people. It's the craziest thing in the world, and it's bad faith. The people at the top, and certainly the people at the top of the scientific and medical professions who are doing this, know that they're lying, and they are hiding things, and they're covering their own asses by it. But a lot of people just go along with it.
Yeah. The discussion of it, and I think, not to get away from this, but I do think it is reasonable to discuss how it affected the election and the popularity of the Democratic Party, and not just from the perspective of COVID, of the pandemic, of the various products that were used to ostensibly treat it, or that we were told not to use it, and there's something wrong with you if you thought maybe one of these other products would work. Okay, that's part of it. But here's the thing, and I think this has really affected the popularity of the Democratic Party. Let's say it was trans women playing sports with women, with girls. And there were people who said, I might have a problem with that. We need to, people were saying, there were doctors who were saying, look, there are physical differences in muscle density, bone density, size. In the reason that women can't jump as high as men has to do with their center of gravity because of their hips, because they have children. So what we're looking at is certain things that are physical that, if you're saying trust the science, are valid discussions. It's not, nobody's screaming, I hate trans people. It's, well, wait a minute. We have the interest of the trans woman, or whatever you want to call it, who wants to play sports, and the interest of all of these women out here who want to play sports, or young girls, people like me. I have a daughter. Well, she's grown now, but when she was young, she was involved in different things, right? And do I want her in a position where she can get injured because a person who scientifically, physically has particular advantage? When my daughter was in high school, she was skinny as a rail, right? She was, like a little girl, 14, 15-year-old girl, oftentimes what they look like, right? And my concerns were for her physical safety, right? It would be valid for me to say, is she in a position where she could get injured because maybe she's playing with people who physically have this tremendous advantage over her? Okay. But to have that discussion was evil. Yeah. Not that you even got to say, well, here's my side of why I think it's wrong. Just to even have a discussion about it was evil. And to have a discussion about the product that was allegedly used for COVID or wasn't allowed to be used for COVID. I think one of the things that hurt the Democrats is this liberal anti-intellectualism that said, if you try to talk about something that we have dogmatically taken a position on, you're not just wrong, you're immoral and evil, and you have to be punished.
Yeah, this is false certainty. It's the assertion of false certainty. And there's nothing worse for political too, but certainly not for the scientific project or for the pursuit of knowledge than false certainty. Every great scientist, the Einstein, Feynman, they all say, I'd rather have 100 questions, 100 unanswered questions than one wrong answer, and I'd rather, false certainty is the death of knowledge. It's the death of science. And all great scientific advances have been made by challenging the official, quote, settled science. The science is never settled. Answers in science lead you to more questions. And so anyway, but the point is, this was the adoption of, there's no question about this. The answer has been given. And if you start to raise a question about it, shut up. You're stupid. And you're not stupid. The people who are doing that were stupid. I mean, they're not ignorant, and that's stupid in the sense of they don't have intellectual capacity. They may be ignorant in the sense they don't know anything because they don't want to know anything. They don't want to look for things where you go to look for things. But it's in terms of taking a position that's helping the human race develop its knowledge, and therefore doing something that's ultimately is going to help politically. That's stupid. False certainty, otherwise known as dogma, is the death of science and thinking, and that's what it was. And they insisted, again, as I say, you can be wrong, or they take a position they're wrong, but they didn't admit the possibility of being wrong. They wouldn't let you talk about it, and they censored people and fired people. They fired doctors who tried to use medications and protocols that were effective, and they fired them because they didn't wait for the harmless magic bullet. That was the whole protocol that was demanded. Patient comes in, send them home until they're ready to get on the ventilator. Until we get the harmless magic bullet. And they did that deliberately. And they did it because if they had a protocol and medications that worked, then they couldn't force everybody to take the harmless magic bullet. So it's it was a terrible thing. And it did have a tremendous effect because people, again, they just felt we were told to shut up, as you say, you know, parents to go to school boards, and they wanted to complain about, or you know, about their girl being in a sports team or in a locker room with biological males, or they wanted to complain about kids being brought for some reason to drag queen stripper, you know, 10-year-old kids story hour. What the heck is that? And they were treated like shit, and they were told to shut up and get out of here. And that's not right. You know, if you want to have a discussion about whether these policies are wonderful for kids or not, have the discussion. But you don't get a meeting of 10 people or get a memo from the federal government saying you have to institute this policy, and anybody who talks about it, shut up. I mean, that's just not right. And people were really pissed off about that. And again, from my point of view, no, these are not the central questions of politics, but of course they were put into the center of politics deliberately in order to make people fight about those things.
And I've said all along, when it came to COVID, you know, I knew people who were getting sick. I had it at one point, you know, I had a couple different times, and you know, like so many other people, Omicron and what have you. My issue was, okay, COVID's here, but the government is making policies. And I have questions about government policies. The government says you have to do this, whether it's lockdown, whether it's take a harmless magic bullet, whether it's you got to wear this when you go in there and you can't fly or travel or eat in a restaurant or things like that. Okay, these are government policies. As a citizen, I have every right to raise questions about government policies. I don't care what it's about. When the government says, people, it's flu season, right? Okay, so because it's flu season, you have to do this, you have to wear this or do this. You can't go that. You got to wear gloves. You got to wear a white CDC spacesuit. I don't know. They could literally come out tomorrow and say, during flu season, everybody has to wear the white CDC spacesuit. We would have every right to say, we'd like to see the scientific evidence of what that's going to do.
Yeah, we want to hear. We want to hear from different scientists. You know,
are there people that don't agree, and why?
We want everybody to put on their expert witness. Not just one side. You know, right. You know, this is you know, scientists and you know, this idea that credit some scientists are the legislators of society. No, they're not. You know, first of all, it's only it's a particular group of scientists they're pointing to. These scientists, it's not scientists in general, it's not science in general. It's this group of scientists are the scientists you have to listen to. If they say something, then you can't argue with it. Scientists are advisors to society. People, a democratic society, that's the way it is. Science gives its opinion in its multifacity. You bring on the expert witnesses from all sides, and the jury decides which expert witness they're going to believe. But if you cut out the expert witness from one side or another, then you're not playing fair. And that's a political game where people are going to say, you're telling me to shut up because this guy that you say is the greatest scientist in the world says X, but I have these other 10 scientists over here because now I have access to, you know, to all of the scientific thinking in the history of the world. And I have access to the best scientists. You know, your guys are the only smart scientists in the world. So I hear things from these other guys or gals that I think are legitimate. I want to hear what Christine Stable-Benn. I urge everyone to look up Dr. Christine Stable-Benn from a Danish scientist. You know, wonderful woman, wonderful a real scientist. Look at her TED Talk. You don't hear from her, that scientist. You didn't hear from Bhattacharya. If a scientist pops up who has some credibility, you institute a media campaign against him. The Great Barrington Declaration had tens of thousands of scientists from all around the world signing it. So what do? You can't say they're all stupid. So you institute a media campaign smearing them. So this is terrible. You can't overestimate how terrible this is and is for the future of humanity. And they're not acknowledging it. They're continuing to do it. They're continuing to attack Bhattacharya on the same damn grounds they did before. And this disproven the Great Barrington Declaration. Now, I have issues with the Great Barrington Declaration. It's not the word of God either, but it was not stupidity. It was not some kind of random bunch of jerks who just decided to get together and be oppositional to Joe Biden for some reason. I mean, this is nonsense. This is the framework of mind they're in, and we can't let them drag us into that. People do, and they have, but just can't let them drag us into that. This is a standalone question. Is this medical practice? Is this medical intervention positive or negative? For which people is it positive? This is not okay. Before I ask that question, I can ask: are the Republicans? What are the Republicans saying about it? What are the Democrats saying? What's Trump saying about it? Forget about it. Really, it's just forget about it. But you can't do that. It's just terrible.
It's something that we've seen that is, to me, a very authoritarian way of looking at it. The terms we use, the liberal authoritarianism, is always about consensus. And they use that word, we have a consensus. Well, okay, you have a consensus amongst the people that you decided were the authorities. So they're like, but we have and they'll use the word, we have a consensus that this, a consensus that that. A consensus. There was once a consensus that the world was flat, and that we had to use leeches because all diseases were blood. There were consensus from the most well-known scientists on earth, but they were wrong. So screw your consensus. And if you're so convinced by your consensus, sunlight is the best disinfectant. Show us how you got the consensus and expose your consensus to review by everyone.
Yeah, exactly. Nothing wrong with acting by consensus. People do it, and it has to be done that way. But what's wrong is trying to shut up any questioning of it and trying to say our consensus is the final word. Everybody, and this is the point for the country, for the society to move along. People have to be willing to say, I was part of a consensus and I was wrong. I was mistaken, and it was important. I was mistaken in important ways. Everybody has to be able to do that in their lives, and consensuses of society have to be able to do that in a certain way. People have to be able to say, I was wrong about this. We were wrong about this in important ways that had bad effects on people's lives. That teaches us a little bit of humility going forward. Any kind of knowledge is provisional, and you have to take actions and you have to act on provisional knowledge. And that's true. That's okay. So you acted on provisional knowledge. But when you learn that it's wrong, you got to be able to say, gosh, I really acted on wrong knowledge and I acted mistakenly. And in this case, I was part of a group of people that shut people up who were telling me that I was wrong, and I didn't want to hear that. And I now have to admit it. If you don't admit it, if you don't say that, then you are a problem for society, because you are saying, okay, you might have been wrong about something because you didn't do the research. You didn't see it. Now it's coming out. Now you see everything's right. You've got to be able to say, and a lot of people did say that, and that's why they're pissed off. They went along with it, and they said, holy crap, I was being lied to by people. I was being led along to take positions that were dangerous and wrong by people who knew that they were dangerous and wrong and not true. And these people all knew. They were saying things that were not true. They were lying, and they knew it. They got up in the public, and they lied to you and got you to go along with things and got you to go along with attacking other people on the basis of their lies, their knowing lies. And that's what you say, well, we were talking before, whether there's going to be a preemptive pardons now for people like Fauci and other people, because Fauci, what's a possible criminal act? He could be brought up for perjury charges.
Rand Paul has credibly accused, and others have credibly accused him of lying to Congress. In particular, he said that he went before Congress and said that they were not involved in gain of function. And there seems to be evidence that at the time that he said that, he had knowledge that they were involved in gain of function, which indicates the possibility that it is valid to question the veracity of his statements when he was before Congress. So it kind of makes sense to me that Joe Biden would do a preemptive pardon. But let me say this. Let's go a little bit more with our timeline. Let's touch on our timeline again. So we got in June, there was something happened at the Fort Detrick in Maryland, this bio research lab, which is a bioweapons lab. Department of Defense doesn't do bio research, they do bioweapons. Okay, June, the CDC is there and there's issues with containment, biocontainment. July, some very strange and odd viruses start to show up at senior centers nearby, and people end up in the hospital dead, and dare I say, on what do you call the lung things they were on ventilators, right? Now, within weeks, a mysterious vaping disease shows up, which might I add about this mysterious vaping disease, as soon as COVID showed up, we got no more articles about the vaping disease. But let's go along with our timeline. June, something weird's happening in the end of June, something weird happens at the bio research lab. July, some weird viral things show up at senior centers and nursing homes. August, there's a mysterious vaping disease. But what happens in September? Executive order on modernizing influenza vaccines in the United States to promote national security and public health. September 19th. Donald Trump, right, by authority invested me as the president of the United States, Donald Trump signs an executive order on modernizing influenza vaccines. This is odd. Now, let me show you something, Jim. Command F. Let's search this document, okay, for the word pandemic. 18 times. So, oddly, September 19th, a few months before, according to what the Department of Defense tells us, an actual pandemic occurred, Donald Trump signs what may be considered the beginning of Operation Warp Speed, shall we say. He signs a document, and look at it. Pandemic, 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 pandemic. Pandemic, 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 pandemic. This approach is insufficient to meet response in the needs in the event of a pandemic, which can emerge rapidly and with little warning. We go on and on and on.
Look up DOD, look up Department of Defense. You'll see they put the DOD and the CDC in charge of this.
Okay, Department of Defense. In addition to the co-chairs, the task force shall consist of senior officials from the following branches. Department of Defense.
Go up a little. No, go before that. Just before that. Who are the co-chairs?
Oh, let's look at it. Let's do that.
Just before that, I think the paragraph before, the co-chairs. Who are the chair of it?
Let's see. Hold on. The task force. Well, they got the Department of Defense, Department of Justice, Agriculture, Veterans, Homeland Security, Food and Drug.
Yeah, but the co-chairs are DOD and CDC, I think.
Yes. Well, I got the Department of Defense right here. But what's interesting is this. The staffs of the State Department. What does the State Department have to do with it, right? So the bottom line is this, and we go further down. In coordination with the DOD, National Institute of Health and Veterans Administration. We keep going down here. In collaboration with the Department of Defense. Look at that everywhere. Department of Defense. The DOD's network of clinical research. Identify opportunities to use Department of Defense vaccine research. Department of Defense is that. So this document, we look at a document. Now, according to, Jim, what we were told, according to the Department of Defense, who's all over this, November 7th was patient 0. So what we're to believe is that 2 months before patient zero, Donald Trump signed an executive order putting the Department of Defense in charge of effectively beginning the response for a pandemic. They specifically use the word pandemic response over and over and over, top to bottom. And I'm supposed to believe that they were organically beginning a pandemic response just a few months after Fort Detrick had an incident and vaping diseases and people are getting sick in nursing homes and then it's like, I got an idea. We haven't had a pandemic in 100 years now. What the hell? And if we have one, a vaccine, we need to do something like Operation Warp Speed. Jim, you got to be an idiot not to see, as we talk about evidence, the evidence is starting to stack up.
Yeah. Look at the title of that. It's about getting an influenza vaccine, right? Read the title again.
Let's do it. Let's look at it. Modernizing influenza vaccines.
Okay, this is all about a vaccine program, right? And it's about a number of things. There are different players involved in this, stakeholders, but let's say players involved in this. And Fauci himself, his white whale, his fantasy goal was to get some kind of universal influenza vaccine. Now, you got to realize influenza vaccines are terrible vaccines by anybody's rendering. Influenza vaccines never work more than 50, 60%, maybe. That's very high. And they're terrible vaccines in terms of the effectivity. Everybody acknowledges that. But Fauci had this thing in mind. That was a obsession of Fauci's, to get a universal influenza vaccine. So, and it's very, and everybody knows it's very hard to do because these viruses mutate very quickly and it's kind of crazy. So modernizing influenza vaccine, that means bringing in mRNA, the mRNA, because that's the only way you can do this. They thought, that's the way we can get this process, this scientific process by which once we get the mRNA technology, we can just plug into it the RNA coding for the strains of virus. And it's turned out to be a disaster, but that's what they were thinking of. So they were looking for that. So that's the pharmaceutical companies. On one level, at the most basic level on this is huge boondoggle for pharmaceuticals. It's adult vaccination. They're saturating kids with vaccines, and it becomes a problem. That's why they create bivalent and trivalent and vaccines, because parents bring their kids in for 6-month-old kid. They get 8 shots. What are you doing? So they put 4 of them in one vial. So then you only get 4 shots. So they're saturated. They got the untapped market is adults. You got to get adults have to vaccinate themselves all the time. And if we can get mandatory adult vaccination, which college vaccination is the camel's nose under the tent. Every college student, boys included, has to have a vaccination for cervical cancer, which doesn't work very well, but you can't go to school. You're an 18-year-old adult, but you have to get vaccinated. That's the first mandatory. So they want to push adult vaccination, a continuous stream. Every year there's a new influenza virus. So we have at the very fundamental one is the vaccine manufacturers, the vaccine investors like Bill Gates. And you have organizations then like the WHO, which Gates fundamentally controlled, and they come in and they create the fear of the pandemic. They have the Event 201. They create and they change the notion. They change the definition of what's a pandemic. They change the definition of pandemic, and then you have the government players who want to, under the guise of all this, be doing this gain of function bioweapons research. To point on that, don't forget that since the institution of the Convention Against Bioweapons and Chemical Weapons in, I think, 1972, the United States has constantly voted against putting in place practices and procedures for verifying that, okay? they said, oh, we can't have practices and procedures for verifying it because that'll be a way for other countries to steal trade secrets or national security secrets. So it's like we're going to have a nuclear weapons treaty, but we can't have any verification of it. Oh, we got to have verification. You wouldn't say we have a nuclear weapons, but you can't verify it. But we're going to have a treaty against biological weapons, but we're never going to have any verification for it. And the United States has constantly voted against that. So this is what you have. You have the elements of the profit-seeking pharmaceutical industries, which have a tremendous amount of power, which buy with a possible extent, more than the financial industry, they pay off politicians. Probably the only lobby that does work more is the AIPAC and the Zionist lobby. And you have that's not just the pharmaceutical companies. It's also these international health organizations captured by Gates and by profit-seeking investors in the pharmaceutical company, and by you have academics and government bureaucrat scientists who have an agenda. And Fauci had a tremendous amount of control, and he had this agenda. I want to create this influenza vaccine, this universal influenza vaccine. And he was dead set on it. And he was able to control funding for all kinds of medical research in the United States. So he would get his way. So you have in the various countries and you have the countries who say, well, this is going to be a way that we can do certain kinds of research that we're not supposed to do under the guise of finding this universal vaccine. So some people, you can go a lot of ways with what's behind this, because there were a lot of things behind it. For me, first of all, it was this is the pharmaceutical industry trying to get us to mandatory adult vaccination, and they're kind of doing. Watch now, the ads on TV. You're going to get vaccinated for this. You're going to get vaccinated for adults. Okay, but adults can make up their own minds. They can report to themselves when they have symptoms. They say, I don't like this symptom, so I'm not going to do this. But that's why it's difficult. So they have to then create a system which is mandatory because there's a pandemic, because there's a fear you're going to kill everybody in the world if you don't go out and vaccinate yourself against this. These are horrible things. So you've got to look into all of this. And that's why looking into things like, the bioweapons research at Fort Detrick, in the Wuhan lab, in the laboratories in Ukraine and in Georgia and in Africa, what Sam Husseini has done with that, these are very important things. But they've done under the rubric which really appeals to the liberal progressive, because I'm a progressive, rational person. I want to do what the science says you have to do. And I'm not an uneducated moron. So, and so science says we got to do this. So we got to do it. And that's all of this is in one big bundle. And it came together. It came together with this COVID event, which was, they were planning to have a pandemic, which what they could call a pandemic, which would get people afraid enough that they were sent to mandatory adult vaccination, and we could start using these new genetic sequencing techniques for this new kind of universal vaccine that's a kind of, they call it, Moderna called its mRNA process an operating system. It's a plug and play. It's a subscription service to vaccines, essentially. We have this way of making a vaccine where it's one operating system, and you plug into it the RNA coding for every vaccine that comes along, and you just pop it in, and it goes into you, and it makes your body produce not the antibodies, but produce the vaccine, the virus. And it's crazy, and it's a very dangerous thing. But they were dead set on it. People like Fauci and the scientists like Barak, they wanted this. The government saw it as an opportunity to do biological weapons research, and the pharmaceutical companies and investors saw it as an opportunity to create a whole new stream of income for them that would be guaranteed by the government and paid for by the government. It's amazing. The government can't pay for your cancer care, but they can pay for you to get any vaccine you want.
Well, let's go on down this timeline a little bit, right? Remember, we had June, we had something weird happen. July, in August, we got now senior centers with weird viral diseases. We got vaping diseases, and then December, Donald Trump signed, September, a month later, Donald Trump signs this executive order that says that has the word pandemic in it. 18 times. Okay. So October comes along and they had something called Event 201. The Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, in partnership with the World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, hosted Event 201, a high-level pandemic exercise on October 18th, 2019 in New York, New York. Okay, so now we've got a pandemic tabletop exercise, but we don't have a pandemic at this time. We have no indication there'll be a pandemic. Well, there hasn't been a pandemic for 100 years, Jim, but for some reason, a month after Donald Trump signs a pandemic response executive order, there's now a tabletop exercise. And this tabletop exercise is a high-level pandemic exercise. But if we search this document for the word coronavirus, right? Let's start here. The Event 201 scenario, okay? So the Event 201 simulates an outbreak of a novel zoonotic coronavirus. So in October, when according to what we were told, there is no pandemic because it hadn't occurred yet. According to the Department of Defense, patient 0 was in Wuhan in 2019. The 7th of November, 2019, 2 weeks before patient 0, 2 weeks before it even started, they had this event, which probably took at least a month to put together. I mean, you didn't put that together that day, right? Mm-hmm. And the event simulates an outbreak of a novel zoonotic coronavirus. And it says there is no possibility of a vaccine being available in the first year. There is a fictional antiviral drug, we could call it like remdesivir or some fictional name like that can help the sick, but not significantly limit the spread of the disease. So, Jim, let's continue. Our timeline is looking more and more suspicious. Very specifically, they had a simulation and a tabletop response simulating how they would respond to a coronavirus outbreak. Mysteriously, 2.5 weeks before a coronavirus outbreak that they had no idea was coming. But over the last couple months, they had several things, including a lab leak. Now, remember, the Chinese say it was a lab leak, but it wasn't from Wuhan. They say that it was I've read it over and over in Chinese articles where they say, no, it came from Fort Detrick, where the Chinese and the Filipino experts both said to the World Health Organization, why won't you research Fort Detrick? Why are you researching? You got to research Fort Detrick. Yeah. What is it with the WHO? You'll research everywhere but Fort Detrick. Why not Fort Detrick? So not only is there something weird that happened in Fort Detrick, the Chinese and Filipinos and others are screaming at the top of their lungs to the WHO, hey, you're doing an investigation, but you won't look at Fort Detrick. Yeah. Event 201. What the hell is that about, Jim?
Well, yeah, they were practicing for this. And the coronavirus, I mean, this is the point.
For what? It didn't exist?
Yeah. No, there are coronaviruses. All the flu viruses and the common cold, those are coronavirus. That's a type of virus. So that's what they were focusing in on and saying, that's why when he said we want an influenza vaccine, we want a vaccine that's going to cope with all possible coronaviruses. Okay. So that's the word coronavirus there is referring to this class of virus that occurs a lot. Okay. COVID-19 is just a new coronavirus. It's a novel coronavirus. So, but coronavirus.
Wait a minute. That's what they said.
I know.
The exact words in Event 201 were a novel coronavirus.
Yeah. What they're saying is we're preparing because there are going to be novel coronaviruses. They're going to appear all the time. So we're preparing that suddenly a novel coronavirus comes, which is absolutely deadly and it's going to kill everybody in the world. It's going to be a pandemic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the game that they were playing, and they're claiming we're getting ready for that. in case it happens,
Within the next
just in
couple weeks.
case, and it just doesn't, it just happened 2 weeks afterwards. So, but this is the point. You're then suspicious. They're working on, while they're doing this, saying, we get ready this in case it happens. They're working on making sure it happens. They're working on gain of function research, which is creating new coronaviruses that are more infectious and deadly to human beings. And that's what they were doing. And there's no question about that. That's what they were doing. And so that's but so this is what, again, there's money in their eyes. There's dollar signs. We're going to have treatments for this that are going to produce a lot, because coronaviruses are all over. They keep coming. The influenza keeps coming. It keeps changing. And we're going to have vaccines against it. And we now have the potential of this way of creating vaccines with mRNA technology.
But let me say this, Jim. But my point, to be honest, here is strictly about the timeline.
Yeah.
I know what they were trying to do, and I know their game plan. But this timeline is something totally different. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The timeline is like, let's see. The person was killed and their body was found wrapped up in duct tape and plastic and buried in a shallow grave on Tuesday. And we do an investigation and we find that Jim used his credit card to buy duct tape and plastic on Sunday evening. The last time the victim was seen was Sunday night, right?
Uh-huh.
There's all kinds of things about the plastic and duct tape and his intention, but the timeline.
You're absolutely right. Absolutely,
you know what I mean?
Yeah,
and so, notwithstanding all of the other things,
you're absolutely right.
The timeline completely,
Stinks.
even I'll put it like this: independent of COVID, independent of treatments of COVID. Why in the hell was Jim buying the duct tape and plastic on Sunday, and the victim was not last seen on Sunday, and with Jim, and we found their body wrapped up in plastic and duct tape. So, notwithstanding all the other things, I could understand if Event 201 was November 19th. Because November 7th, I'd even say, how the hell did you put that together in 7 days? You know what I mean? In a week. But notwithstanding all of that, 2 weeks before, and even then, if we were to say, well, it could happen at any time. It could happen 2 weeks afterwards. And taking into account all the things that happened, mysteriously, just the things that happened with the timeline, a leak from a lab and people sick on ventilators, old folks in an old folks home get hit first, mysterious, all these things. And I get to that timeline, and the end of the timeline is, what do you know? You know what I mean? We prepared a pandemic response all the way up to the day. And then, Jim,
I know.
Lucky?
This is exactly what we're talking about with evidence. This is something that begs for an investigation. Okay.
Yes.
To see whether all of this was just a coincidence, or whether it's just a coincidence that I happened to buy all that duct tape, or whether or not there was a connection between this. You have to do some investigation. That's exactly right. And people did, and people like Bobby Kennedy Jr. did. I mean, and that's what they got attacked for. And you got to believe a lot of coincidence. If to see this all as just a coincidence. And no, I mean, how
about this, Jim? Let me give you an example. As an investigator, tell me if these things make sense. Here's what I do. Apparently there was, according to the articles, when I start by saying, let me go to the CDC and find out all of the documentation from when they went to the lab and there was a problem at the lab. Let's look at the documentation and see what the problem was, right? Next, suddenly some people got sick at some senior citizen's home, right? And what they said was the CDC took samples and did investigations, right? those samples still exist. Let's go see what those samples are.
Yep.
Right? Number one. Number two, Donald Trump signed this thing. Okay. What was the impetus? Let's look. I want to see where the first emails came from that said we need a vaccine thing. Let's look at the first emails. Who was it that approached whom? Who approached somebody that approached somebody that got to Trump and said we need to do it? Let's go backwards and see who was patient zero when it came to saying we need to suddenly do that. Next, Event 201. I want to see the first email. Who contacted Bill Gates? What the hell is Gates always in the middle of this crap? The WEF? Shockingly, what are they always? You know what I mean?
Are they doing there? Yeah.
Where did the first email come to that said, we need to do this? Now, you know, one of the women that was in charge of Event 201, Avril Haines.
Yeah.
As soon, you know who Avril Haines became very shortly after that?
DNI.
Joe Biden's department, DNI, which is your what is the DNI? What
National Intelligence Department.
Director of National Intelligence. So the person who ran the Event 201 became the Director of National Intelligence as soon as Joe Biden came in. So from an investigative perspective, Jim, you would want to say, who was the first person that said, you know, I think we need to do this? And where the hell are those samples from those senior citizens' home? Oh, might I add, one of the things that the Chinese brought up in one of their documents was the fact that a guy in November in New Jersey got sick. They tested him a few months later. He had the antibodies to COVID. So it seems that COVID was in New Jersey in November. But wait a minute. How could it be in New Jersey in November when it came from Wuhan in November? It jumped all the way there. And did you test the seniors? That were, you know what I mean? Why?
Look, this is one of the
when
things.
we talk about science, science says all these questions have to be answered. But what we found out, two things, and that is, number one, they blocked the World Health Organization from looking into Fort Detrick. And if you follow Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, who did an investigation for the Lancet, Dr. Jeffrey Sachs also said that he got suspicious when he found out the U.S. government was blocking his investigation. Personally, I don't think it came from Wuhan. Oh, by the way, you know what the Chinese also said? They said that there was a military
there's a military exercise,
and that one of the women was riding a bicycle and collapsed with flu-like symptoms. One of the Americans involved in the military games that came there, oh, by the way, her husband worked at Fort Detrick. And she collapsed during the military games. There is a theory that it didn't start in Wuhan, that it started in Fort Detrick, and perhaps ended up in perhaps accidentally, perhaps not accidentally. Because let me say this, Jim, let me throw this at you. Being a diabolical kind of thinker like me, if I said, man, they're going to find out what's going to happen, what do I want them to do? Well, they're going to be suspicious. Let's make them chase the wrong place.
That's right.
Let's plant this thing at Wuhan. When they start looking, I want them to think we're hiding that it came from Wuhan, so that they'll keep searching for Wuhan, and then they'll say, aha, we got them now. See, we knew it came from Wuhan. They tried to hide it. What if I want to make it look like it came from Wuhan because I don't want them sniffing around Fort Detrick?
It's all perfectly plausible to me. And it's exactly the kind of thing they do with not just limited hangouts, but diversionary hangouts, you know, when the government announces, oh, we found out this terrible thing that we did, it's like the thing with the guy, the doctor, the guy who jumped out the window, was pushed out the window of the hotel, the scientist, I forget his name now. We gave him LSD and he jumped out the window. You know the story? I forget. It was
Frank. What's his name?
Lumberg or something like that. Well, Lautenberg. And
there was a documentary made about him too.
Yeah, Errol Morris did a documentary called Wormwood. It was very good because what happened was, it was interesting because he was part of the biological weapons program essentially, and they had given him LSD, but it had been previously. and he was in New York for something, and he supposedly jumped out the window, but was probably pushed. And the government, it came out, oh my God, the government gave him LSD, and that's why he jumped out the window and went crazy. And the government made a big show. You're right, we're sorry. It was our responsibility. They gave the Congress, first time I think in history, they actually made an apology for something like that. They gave an award to the family. The Congress gave an award for the family under the rubric that, yeah, we slipped him LSD clandestinely and he jumped out the window because he was on a bad trip. But actually what happened was he was part of the biological weapons program, and he was about to reveal about the biological weapons use of the United States and Korea, and they killed him before he did. So it was an admission of a crime to cover up another crime. And on a most trivial level, I mean, Fauci did that. He lied about lying. He told us not to wear masks, and then he said, "Oh, I was lying about that because I want to save it for the I wanted to save the mask for the health workers." No, he wasn't lying about that. It was the second thing he said that was a lie. He admitted he was a liar about one thing in order not to let you know about the reality of it. The first time he spoke, he was right. Masks don't really help. And he knew he was speaking right off the cuff, and he was speaking on the basis of the scientific knowledge that was available. The second time he's talking was after he had gone through this whole rigmarole about double and triple masking and how terrible it is not to wear a mask and blah, 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 which was a bunch of lies. So in order to cover up that pack of lies, he lied about the first thing he said was true. Anyway, the point is this happens all the time. And exactly what we were saying before, these kinds of things are reasons to investigate. And what they're doing about this is they hide the data. And this is public data. This is publicly financed practice. All of this data, and the Chinese should open up their whatever they're hiding about the Wuhan lab. They should open it up, and the Americans, have to open up all this data. Where are the emails about this? Where are the cell cultures of the people who died in the retirement community, etc. They hide the data. They don't allow people to do autopsies they forbid autopsies of people who died from the magic.
I think it wouldn't be hard, would it?
So they hide the data on who was vaccinated and who wasn't vaccinated. They hide the data. There's no excuse for that in any kind of legitimate scientific process and in any kind of process that's publicly funded. And they hide the data. They tried to hide the data about the clinical trials for 75 years. What's the reason for that? Other than we got shit. We're hiding.
They wanted to come out with. What's the guy's name? Laptop. The guy with the guy that got shot in the back in the alleged robbery.
Seth Rich.
Yeah, they wanted it to come out with Seth Rich laptop at the same time because they tried to do the same thing with that, But you see, when you look at it, here's the thing about it. Sometimes something's too easy. And what's his name? Jon Stewart. I remember Jon Stewart went on one of these shows and they were asking him whether it was a lab leak or whatever. Jon Stewart said, "It's in the name." You remember? It's in the name of the lab. And I thought about it. Yeah, that's too easy.
Yep.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They're not stupid. And I thought, okay. Supposedly COVID showed up on November the 7th, 11 miles from this thing in a wet market, right?
Yeah.
Nobody's going to believe that. Nobody. I mean, you got to be pretty naive to believe that, right? Okay. And you look at it and you're like, and it's the name of it is the, Wuhan lab for coronavirus or something, right? And Jon Stewart said it's in the name. And I thought, yeah, it's just too obvious, right? It's just a few miles away and all of that. And so the evidence that I have that it came from Wuhan is it was close by and they were working on that stuff in that lab. Okay, I got that. So there's some evidence to say it was close by there and they were working on that stuff in the lab. Okay. Now, what's the evidence that it was in Fort Detrick?
Yeah. Yep.
There was a lab leak in Fort Detrick.
Yep.
A bunch of people less than an hour's drive away got sick with the same exact symptoms as COVID.
Yep.
The CDC refused to give any evidence on the lab leak, and the New York Times said it was because of national security reasons, right? And then a weird vaping disease showed up that coincidentally disappeared
Yeah.
At the same time, the COVID showed up, right?
Mhm.
And when I look, and then I look at the stuff that Trump and Event 201, and I say the evidence that COVID was out in the population before November 7th is overwhelming.
Yeah.
The evidence that it came from Fort Detrick, I'm not going to say it's overwhelming, it's powerful evidence.
Yeah.
The evidence that it came from Wuhan is circumstantial, and one might argue so convenient that it seems planted.
Yeah. And certainly the
we
wet
use-
market thing was ridiculous, and they had to kind of give up on that pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But that what it was. Yeah.
I think it was intentionally ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the fact of the matter, people brought this up early before I even realized this. And when I found out that a bunch of American military people, by the way, Fort Detrick is what? Department of Defense.
Yeah.
A bunch of people from the Department of Defense showed up in Wuhan just before that supposedly happened. And according to the Chinese, a woman collapsed and was hospitalized of flu-like symptoms, and her husband worked at Fort Detrick.
Yeah.
You start to say maybe it wasn't Wuhan, and maybe, I'm not going to say, look, the argument of whether it was deliberately led or not, we don't know that. We probably never will. Okay. But one could argue, one could surmise that once it was out, that somebody said, look, we can't have it out from here because this is going to be bad. Is there a place? Well, we don't like the Chinese and we want to, say they did everything wrong. Number one, so China's perfect place. And we're doing some work with this stuff anyway in Wuhan. Let's just say somebody was to show up in Wuhan coughing and not slobbering all over the place. And then we point the finger there.
Yep. No, it's perfectly plausible. And as you say, there's at least as much circumstantial evidence that it was Fort Detrick as there was more than there is that it was Wuhan, because it's not like the same kinds of research aren't being done at Fort Detrick. And those were BioLab 3 and 4, biosecurity level 3 and 4 in Fort Detrick. Those are the highest levels of security that were compromised, apparently. And so, it's very easy. It's at least as plausible that it came from Fort Detrick as it came from the Wuhan lab. That's true. I mean, there's no more solid evidence of one than the other, I don't think, especially if, again, you'd have to look at those cases in the retirement community and the vaping disease and see what they were and see the histology of that. They're going to hide the evidence of it. That's, that's and they'll say, even asking the question, that's the point. They're going to say, even for you to ask the question, that just proves you're a conspiracy theorist. And so we can't bother. We can't lower ourselves to respond to that question as if it's a reasonable question. You're a conspiracy theorist. So,
You know what was a conspiracy theory? This is a book called Bitten.
Oh,
I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Lyme disease.
The Secret History of Lyme Disease and Biological Weapons. And in this particular book, they talk about Lyme disease and the fact that the place where Lyme disease was first discovered, Lyme, Connecticut, whatever, or some place, I forgot the name of Connecticut.
Yeah,
was 12 miles from a biological research facility of something island in New York. Plum Island, New York.
Yeah.
And in that biological research facility, they were working on diseases that would be put on ticks, grown and moved by ticks. And 12 miles away, a disease suddenly popped up that was in ticks.
Tick-borne disease, yeah.
Yeah, tick-borne disease. So has the government ever come out and said that, well, that's what happened? We got books. The guy who was in charge of that whole ticks disease thing would never, to his deathbed, wouldn't come out and say what it was, but his basically refusals were like, well, I'm not going to say what it is. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So with this history of, I'll put it like this, I'm suspicious about the first SARS.
Absolutely.
And
Look,
MERS, Middle Eastern respiratory.
absolutely, and AIDS. I mean, this is all very suspicious, and it is kind of a
MERS, AIDS, yep.
yeah, it is kind of a subterranean set of practices, the biological warfare business of the United States that goes back for a long time. You got to look at the stuff about the Korean War. I think Jeffrey Kay is the name of the guy who's written about that. Very good. You know, they were using biological warfare in the Korean and germ warfare. They were dropping, infected fleas and flies and whatever over Korea, and that's where the term brainwashing came from, because the American pilots who were captured, who said we were dropping, we got these crazy orders to drop these chemical and biological weapons and these insects all over. So with the American, and they had been told, the American pilots had been told, you can say whatever they've been told. You don't have to withhold information. It's bizarre. You got to read up on this. So when they confessed to this to the communist Chinese and to the Koreans, the American press said, "Oh, they must have been brainwashed because they're making false confessions about this, right? Because they confessed to having taken place in biological warfare stuff." So that's why they invented the term brainwashing. And that, they not that that's not a real thing. It's a good term in a certain sense. But what they were saying is the Chinese communists, or hypnotized them into signing these false confessions, and then when they got back, they all got told to get in line and get toe the line. But so that's where that all came from, and that's very important. That was in the 1950s, and it's been going on since then. As I said, I think it's Lautenberg, the name of the scientist, the LSD scientist, the wormwood guy. You go through it. This has been going on for a long time. And now they're all over the world, 200 places around, over 200 bio warfare, biochemical, bio labs, but it's, dual use biochemical, biological research that's being done. They outsourced it. It's no longer at Plum Island. I think Plum Island is gone. But Fort Detrick is still there, and we went through this whole thing with the anthrax scare. Well, that came from Ames, Iowa. That was the Ames when they did the anthrax scare after 9/11. That was a big thing that got everybody ramped up for attacking all the terrorist Muslims around the world, because apparently terrorist Muslims were sending anthrax into congressional offices. Turned out that was absolutely identified as a strain of anthrax that came from American biowarfare lab in Ames, Iowa.
Well, actually, and the guy that they accused of doing it, the doctor, was the doctor out of Fort Detrick.
Yeah.
And guess what happened to him before he could talk?
He died.
Yeah. He committed suicide.
Yeah, I know. They tried to frame him for it. They still don't know clearly who's responsible for it. So all of this is going on, and very, very rarely reported on in any way, shape, or form. So we have no idea how deep and extensive is the use, not just the research, but the use of biological weapons.
It's been alleged that they were used against the Cubans. Did you know that?
Well,
have you ever read any of that they were used in Cuba, that they were used against Cubans? It has been alleged. There is some evidence out there. I don't know.
I think that's evidence. I think they acknowledged they used it against the Cuban crops.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, they used it to try and destroy the crops. So, yeah. And again, this is something very rarely talked about. And it's a whole apparatus that's global. As Ukraine, Georgia, Africa, these bio warfare labs and bio weapons labs, bio research labs are all around the world, run by the United States. And Fauci was in charge of that.
Yeah.
That's why he was the highest paid employee of the United States government, because they trusted him to fundamentally be the civilian in charge of that, along with the Department of Defense.
Yeah, crazy stuff. Well, Jim, I think we've here's what I have to say. I was going to jokingly say we resolved it, but no, here's what we've done. We've presented a timeline that raises questions. We presented a timeline. And what was it that you said? We'd rather have 100 unanswered questions than one wrong answer.
Yeah.
We don't have an answer. That's but right. It's difficult to look at that timeline and not at least suspect that it came from Fort Detrick. Suspect it. We don't know that it did. Yeah. It's difficult not to look at that timeline and say, someone needs to investigate and find out what happened to the samples. The CDC did investigations. What did the CDC find? You know, that's the question. Here, how easy is this? Garland, you're in charge. Great. I need to go to the CDC. I need some independent scientists. You guys still got the samples. We need to take the samples out. Forget what you found before. Hold on. Give me the results of the original thing. I want the samples done here. And I want to send somebody back to question the people that worked at those places. I want to know what they were told when the government came there. Were they told that you're not allowed to say anything? Were they told to sign anything? You know what I mean? See, you know how that works. They go in and they say, for national security reasons, you're not allowed to think anything, blah, blah, blah. You acknowledge that, blah, blah, blah. Sign here. What were these people told? What did the doctors at the hospital find when they got there? What were the findings? What were the lab results when these people got to the hospital? Vaping disease. Show me the
histology. Show me the lab results. Exactly. Show me any scans you did, any histological analysis that you did.
Is there any tissue left?
Exactly.
From any of the samples of some of the people that died of lab disease of that disease.
Vaping disease.
Let's go and test this tissue. This is not difficult stuff.
That's right. That's right. This is exactly the point. These are not difficult things to do. They're made to sound like, oh, it's impossible. An investigation is possible. It can proceed. Answers may not be found, but may be found. And if they're never going to be found if you don't do the investigation. And this is what, you got to say, we recognize this as evidence that needs to be investigated, that calls for an investigation. And that's what they refuse to do.
Well, it's like this. Jim, the investigator Garland shows up. Jim, I got a few questions. Sure. Why were you buying duct tape and plastic on Sunday? Now, Jim may simply say, well, I was putting plastic over my windows for the winter. Come around here. Let me show you.
Yeah, exactly.
Here's the packages where they came in. Here's the windows. Look at the packages. It shows that I bought 8.9 square feet of plastic. Let's measure it out. Boom, 8.6. I bought it. Here's this. Here's that. Blah, blah, blah. Where you saw with the scene with the victim. Yes, I dropped him off at the bus station. Let's go down and look at the videotape. Yep, there's Jim dropping him off. There's Jim driving away. Oh, there's a Ring camera from Jim's next door neighbor showing Jim put plastic over. Now I have determined Jim didn't have anything to hide. Now, hey, Jim, why'd you buy that plastic and duct tape? I'm not going to say anything. Talk to my lawyer. I guess I'm going to have to find out myself. Right? That's all it is. It's simple as that. This is not complicated stuff. I have a feeling that if somebody started snooping around the CDC saying, let me see the emails, let me see the tissue samples, that they get national security. I've been told by the Department of Defense. I've not, and some guys with dark sunglasses and grim looks on their faces would show up at your door. Garland and Jim, we think you need to stop this investigation. And one way or the other, it'll be stopped. If you understand what we're saying.
I got a lot of duct tape.
All right, Jim. Well, thanks a lot. And thank you, everybody. Go to Jim Kavanagh. He's the polemicist, and you can go at the polemicist.net. But go to Jim Kavanagh's Substack, and you'll find all of his stuff there, all of his good works. Also, follow me on Rockfin. Follow me on Rumble. Definitely. And you never know if they decide to heave this one off, which is possible. I don't know that we did anything wrong. I mean, we said things that should be allowed in a normal country, in a country where there's freedom. We should be allowed to say the things we said, but we'll see. We don't know whatever the hell's going to happen. But you can, no matter what, this is going to be on Rumble and Rockfin. That we know it's not censored there. Also, share this on all your social media platforms. And of course, if you can afford to Patreon or PayPal or buy me a coffee, that would be great too. Thanks a lot. And Jim will be, and I'll be back soon to talk about, I don't know, maybe Jim and I will get, Joe Biden will give us
pardon. I want a pardon.
Back in 2014. I want the same as Hunter. That's what I'm getting.
Okay.